at the Center for Urban Transportation Research at the University of South Florida. She received her bachelor's and master's degrees in civil engineering from USF in 2013 and 2015, respectively. As a research associate, Ms. Godfrey is responsible for oversight of graduate research assistants on the mobility policy research team. She collects and analyzes transportation data trends for use by policymakers locally throughout the state of Florida and nationally. Ms. Godfrey is similar with many data sources such as the National Travel Survey, the American Community Survey, FHWA Highway Statistics Series, National Transit Database, and many of the nuances associated with each source. And with that, Jody
Tyler,
can
you have.
begin presenting.
Thank you so much, Tyler. That was such a kind introduction. So first, thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules today to join us and to discuss some of the national transit observations from the 2017 National Household Travel Survey data that was released last year. So I want to start by acknowledging all of the amazing people who I worked with to analyze the data and discern the trends and implications of those trends, including one of my most influential mentors, Dr. Steve Polzine. Additionally, Tyler, who just introduced me, and my past graduate research assistants, both Richard Driscoll and Kurt Lehman, were all instrumental in the development of this research. So a big thank you to each of those gentlemen. So moving right along into the outline of the presentation today, first I'm going to cover some of the survey and sample characteristics just to ensure that we all have a general understanding of where the data originates from. This is really important to understand the sample, the methodology, and the data that's collected in order to make meaningful observations and subsequent considerations for public transit stakeholders. Once we cover some of the survey and sample characteristics, I'll transition into reviewing some of the findings of the demographic profiles of those transit users, with a specific focus on traits that are known to play a role in mode choice decisions, such as vehicle ownership, auto availability, income, employment status, home ownership status, gender and age, race and ethnicity, urban and rural classifications, and then I'll touch on some of the transportation network characteristics and implications related to transit. So when I talk transportation network companies or TNCs, I'm talking about the ride-hailing application use of like Uber and Lyft, just for clarification. And then finally, I'll touch on some public transit competitiveness in terms of travel time and travel time components, and then some of the implications of the changes in those components over time before I conclude with some just general observations and remarks. So moving right into the survey sample, the 2017 NHTS data was collected from a national sample of 129,696 U.S. households. Of those households, almost 26,100 were from a national sample, while the other 103,600 additional households were from add-on partners who invested additional funds to increase the sample size in their particular geographic area. Those add-on partners include Arizona, California, Georgia, Maryland, New York, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, and Wisconsin, and then also MPOs from Dallas, Fort Worth, Des Moines, Iowa, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and then Waterloo, Iowa. And from that sample, each household is asked to provide detailed information on all travel that occurred by all household members in the household that are 5 years or older for a specified 24-hour period, which they designate as their travel day. So getting into the methodology of the survey, thinking briefly of the history of the NHTS, it started as the Nationwide Personal Transportation Survey, or the NPTS, between 1969 and 95, and then it transitioned to the NHTS in 2001. And since 2001, there have been 2 additional surveys, the 2009 and then the most recent 2017 survey. So the 1995 NPTS was the first to use the 2-phase random digit dialing methodology to collect travel information. And the phases included a telephone recruitment followed by a mail out of a travel log for each member. And while that worked great up until about 2001, by 2009, that requirement of the landline in that random digit dialing methodology made it an unacceptable methodology to collect a representative sample. And so therefore, as of 2017, the NHTS changed their sampling methodology to an address-based sampling, and that's to overcome that landline necessity. So the 2017 survey also uses a two-stage ABS collection methodology, which starts with a mail-out, mail-back recruitment questionnaire, and is then completed with a travel day information web-based questionnaire. So for those respondents that are not comfortable using the web, they did also offer the phone interview retrieval opportunity for the very end. So one other survey change that I should highlight is that in the 2017 NHTS, they used a mapping component to determine travel distances using a shortest path algorithm. And so previous surveys relied on self-reported distances, and thus trip length changes are interpreted cautiously with this 2017 data. It's also important to remember that the data that I'm presenting today stems from an analysis of a sample, not a census, so meaning every household in the US was not surveyed. This, as is the case for all survey analyses, introduces the possibility for sampling error effects. So these sampling error effects have to be taken into consideration, especially as analyses get more detailed or focus on smaller geographic areas, because those sample errors increase as you get to smaller geographies or smaller segments of the population. And so taking those sampling error possibilities into consideration and considering the fact that this research focused on transit, the analyses performed were limited to large subnational geographies to avoid unreasonably large sampling errors. And so let's look into some of these sampling errors, coefficient of variations. This table shows the numerical sample size values to show how the coefficient of variation was calculated for select segments of the population. It's important to note that while this table shows sample size data, all other numerical results in this report have been estimated using the weighted datasets from the 2017 NHTS, so not the sample size. The coefficient of variation is 2.3% for the full US population, indicating that the standard of error as a whole is 2.3% of the estimate. The coefficient of variation is slightly higher at 3.3% for all transit trips made by persons in zero vehicle households. And although the sample is smaller than 40% of the full US sample, 3.3% is still a reasonable coefficient of variation. And so we specifically looked into each of these coefficient of variations just because we know that they impact the propensity for transit use, and we wanted to be sure that they were reasonably small. The table shown on this slide includes data on transit use in 2009 compared to 2017 using the NHTS data. And it's important to note that the sample of transit trips in 2017 was nearly 30% larger than in 2009. It's also interesting to note that in both reporting periods, the average number of transit trips for the travel survey day is less than 2. Another interesting observation is that the overall decline in trip making may have played a factor in increasing transit mode share. What is unknown is whether or not persons using transit have a greater or lesser tendency to reduce trip making relative to the overall decline in per capita trip making. Specifically, are there types of trips made on transit that are less likely to be forgone or replaced with communication instead of travel? And these are the types of questions that the survey really isn't able to directly answer for us. And this table really does have a lot of really interesting different comparisons, so that I won't get into in the interest of time, but you might want to look at it further after you download the slides. The figure on this slide compares the trend in submode split between bus and rail transit submodes for the US dating back to the 1995 NPTS survey. And you can see that the trends in general are showing both for the National Transit Database and the National Household Travel Survey data that bus share is decreasing while rail share is increasing over the years. So there were some slight nuances that were considered for each of these, and things like subway, elevated rail, commuter bus were all integrated into the different bus or rail modes over the years. So now moving to the demographic profile of transit users, one of the areas of interest for public transportation is understanding specifically the market segments and the extent to which various markets are using public transportation. So public transportation has always been critical to those individuals who do not have automobiles available or are unlicensed to drive. But as this segment of the population has declined over time, the public transportation industry has sought to attract other travelers who, for various reasons, find public transportation to meet their needs. Specifically, public transportation has increasingly targeted areas with high cost parking, high demand, special events, or other characteristics where public transportation might be competitive. So for instance, numerous communities have added express or guideway services connecting airports to downtowns and other destinations. Convention centers, arenas, major retail centers, intermodal transportation centers, and universities are among some of the activity centers that transit agencies have really sought to serve, in addition to those CBDs that have historically dominated transit traveler destinations. So the desire to expand the role that public transit can play in meeting mobility needs definitely motivates a desire to become more competitive in meeting travel needs for a broader demographic market. The figure on this slide shows the historic trend of the share of transit use by household vehicle ownership count. And vehicle ownership has been found to be one of the most significant influential factors in the trends in transit ridership. And so, as the data indicate, the zero vehicle household component of the market has been almost half of all riders over the past 3 survey cycles. The share of travel by this segment has remained high, but has declined modestly with the most recent survey. The most recent survey also shows a slight increase in the share of transit trips that were made by members of households that have 3 or more vehicles. In the most recent NHTS, 25.1% of all transit trips taken by residents of zero vehicle households were from those whose income was in the top 3 income quintiles, suggesting that financial constraints were not a factor in their decision to have no household vehicles. And so that's really something that's worth some consideration, is the share of zero vehicle households that are zero vehicle by choice and not by income restraints. So in prior surveys, these shares were 20.5% and 17.8% in 2009 and 2001 respectively. So that 2017 data showed meaningful larger shares in the top 2 quintiles. That's definitely something that should be explored further in the next survey as well. So these 2 figures show how the share of transit use varies by the relationship between vehicles available and workers within the household for both 2009 and the 2017 NHTS survey year, so that you could compare the changes. Zero vehicle households with at least 1 worker account for the largest share of public transit trips. That's 32.5% in 2009 and then 27.4% in 2017, followed by zero vehicle households with no workers at 15.6% and 18.2% in 2009 and 2017 respectively. Households that have less vehicles than workers generally require at least 1 worker to use a non-drive-alone commute mode. Obviously. And in 2009, 16.7% of all transit trips were of household members that were vehicle deprived. In 2017, that share increased to 17.9%. And these workers, again, are more likely to be transit-dependent riders in general. However, choice riders account for a significant share of transit trips as well. Choice riders are defined as members of households that have an equal number of workers and vehicles or a vehicle surplus. And that share of theoretical choice riders was 35% in 2009 and increased to 36.4% in 2017. So the most notable trend shown in this next figure is the increased transit share of each segment in 2017 when compared to the 2009 survey data. This is expected due to the increased share in transit usage that was mentioned on that previous slide with the big table. The transit Transit accounts for 25.3% of trips taken by members of households that have no vehicles available and at least one worker, while 19.9% of trips are taken by members of households with no workers and no vehicles available are on transit. As auto availability increases, the transit share of total trips decreases, regardless of the number of workers in the household. However, the households with more workers than vehicles consistently account for higher transit mode shares than their counterparts that have an equal number of workers and vehicles. Households with vehicle surplus or more vehicles than workers have the smallest transit mode shares. And then the autos equal to workers category does not include the one auto with one worker households. So they're all mutually exclusive here. This is a really interesting and very powerful chart when taken into consideration. And it's perhaps the most powerful testimony to the importance of vehicle availability, which is shown by looking at the per capita annual trips by transit as a function of household vehicle availability. So this figure shows the difference in 2009 and 2017 NHTS data. And that dramatic decline in transit trip making as a function of household vehicles has tremendous explanatory power in understanding transit use. So going from 0 vehicles to 1 vehicle per household results in an over 80% decline in per person transit trip making, dropping from an average of 227 annual transit trips to just 40. And then if you go beyond that and add just one more vehicle to the household, so going from 1 vehicle to 2 vehicles results in an additional 70% decline in transit trip making. So obviously vehicle availability contributes pretty significantly to transit ridership trends. And somewhat related to vehicle availability is income. And so that's the second income category that we're going to talk about, the second element. And this second element, the income distribution of transit travelers, shows the ability to attract higher income individuals to public transportation services that are sufficiently attractive to appeal to individuals who are likely to have choice for other travel. And so that's why I think in general, as you'll see from this figure, rail tends to increase because it's a faster travel choice. So growth in these market segments suggests an opportunity for continued expansion of public transportation ridership and provides an opportunity for these market segments to garner more of the direct benefits of public transportation. Overall, income distribution of transit riders can be extracted from the NHTS dataset, and it's most useful to express transit use in terms of mode share, which normalizes for differences in income bracket size and household counts. So the data indicates that travelers from higher income households comprise a larger share of travelers on rail modes, and that this is indicative of numerous factors, including the prevalence of higher incomes in some of the larger metropolitan areas that provide rail services. And it also reflects the fact that these services are typically higher speed travel and often cater to destinations such as CBDs and airports that are frequent destinations for higher income individuals. This figure goes a little bit deeper into the transit user submode split by income quintiles and then by mode as well. So this figure displays the trend in bus versus rail transit trip shares over the past 3 NHTS surveys. The overall trend in submode shares has remained relatively similar over the survey years, with rail consistently accounting for less than 25% of all lowest income quintile population transit trips, and also accounting for at least 60% of all the highest income quintile population transit trips. As of the most recent survey, 73.4% of all people in the highest quintile that took public transit used a rail mode, while 26.6% took transit bus on their travel day. So you can see the vast difference there. This figure here is showing the nominal transit trips by income quintile over the 3 years. And so you can just in general see that trend, that middle quintile tends to typically have the lowest number of transit trips. And while not directly comparable with the National Household Travel Survey, this data is from the 2017 U.S. Census Bureau American Community Survey data, which reaffirms the general trends with the higher use of subway or elevated rail and railroad in the higher income categories. And then even bus use ticked up at the highest income, but remained well below the mode share numbers for low income bus users. Here in this ACS data. And while not apparent at this particular graph scale, ferry use also trended up with income, and streetcar was somewhat bipolar with higher use at the low and high income groups and lower use by the middle income categories. So transitioning now to trip purpose. Trip purpose is one factor that plays a significant role in the mode choice decisions, and as such, it's important to consider how transit ridership varies across different trip purposes. And so this figure shows that transit was the mode of choice for 3.7% and 5.5% of all work trips in 2009 and 2017, respectively. This indicates that the mode share of work-related transit trips increased 1.8 percentage points between 2009 and 2017. The transit mode share of work trips is second only to medical and dental trips as of 2017. From another perspective, trips to and from work account for the largest share of all transit trips at 37.4% of all transit trips, as shown in this figure. And then next, shopping accounts for 13.1% of all transit trips, which is just behind commuting. This figure is showing the transit share of total trips by the household worker count in 2017, and the variation in transit mode share by the number of household workers. Generally, workers travel more than non-workers due to the necessity to travel to and from their place of employment. So increased workers in a household typically equates to increased travel, but not necessarily increased transit shares. Worker status is another element that adds insight with respect to the public transportation market. So work trips account for a significant share of total transit trips, as shown previously, and account for the second highest transit mode share for all trip purposes. Considering commuting accounts for such a significant share of all trips, it's important to consider how the number of workers in a household affects the propensity to use transit. So members of one worker households account for the largest share of total transit trips at 35.9%, followed closely by two worker households at 31.6%, and then no worker households at 22.8%. Looking into some other demographic characteristics, home ownership is one consideration that definitely varies when it comes to transit ridership trends. So members of renter-occupied homes account for a disproportionate share of transit trips. Typically, renter-occupied homes account for about a third of all occupied homes, which is a trend that's remained mostly consistent over time, irrespective of the survey. The table to the left here shows the comparison between the National Household Travel Survey and the American Community Survey for 2009 and 2017 survey years. While the share of renters only constitutes about 1/3 of total occupied housing, renters account for more than 4 times the share of public transit trips than homeowners. The figure on the right shows that the public transit mode share of all transit trips for renters has slightly increased 0.9 percentage points over the NHTS survey years from 4.3% in 1995 to 5.2% in 2017. During that same time, the public transit mode share of total trips made by occupants of owned homes increased from 0.9% to 1.3%, an increase of only 0.4 percentage points. So the transit mode share of occupants of rented homes is 4 times that of the occupants of owned homes, obviously a disproportionate relationship. Gender is another characteristic to consider, and so the public transit mode share in general, though, does not vary much by gender. Males and females are consistently within less than half a percentage point of mode share variance. Over the survey years, the differences between transit mode shares by gender have decreased, and as of 2017, males had a higher share of transit trips than females. In 2001, females used transit on 2.13% of all trips, while males used transit on 1.86% of their trips, a difference of 0.27 percentage points. In 2009, women still took transit at a slightly larger mode share than men at 2.01 and 1.82% respectively. But then as of 2017, the NHTS data revealed that males have a slightly larger transit mode share than women at 2.57 and 2.52% respectively. So the figure to the left here, as we look into public transportation travel by age, shows daily trips by age group. And this is daily total person trips. As expected, per capita trip rates peak at that 36 to 45 age group. And the daily trip rates are generally, because daily trip rates are generally higher in working age people when you compare to those that are younger or older. So this daily per capita trip rate is especially influential when it comes to transit, when you also consider the transit mode share simultaneously, which is shown to the right. So that figure to the right displays the share of total trips that are made on public transit by age group, which peaks at the 16 to 25 age bracket. The daily per capita trip increase through the 36 to 45 age group, while the share of transit trips increases only through that 16 to 25 age group. And so when you superimpose those, you can definitely see the difference in the transit trip rate by age group. Taking a slightly different perspective, this figure compares the share of transit trips by the age group of the person traveling for the 2009 and 2017 survey years. And while the trends have remained relatively consistent over the years, the share of transit trips taken by the older population is increasing. It's important to note that the size and share of this cohort is also increasing. Between 2009 and 2017, a smaller share of transit trips were made by persons 5 to 25 years old, while a larger share of transit trips were taken by those aged 26 and above. This trend has led to an increase in the average age of transit trips. And the average age of the transit user is increasing over the survey years, which is at least partially reflected from the population. In general, the aging of the population. From 2009, when the average age of a transit user was 34.2 years old, the average age has increased 20.5% to 41.2 years old as of 2017. This again has significance when you consider how the daily trip rates decrease as age increases, shown just a couple slides back. As mentioned previously, public transit mode share rates and person trip rates vary by age group, with that peak daily trip occurring at the 36 to 45 age range, and that peak transit mode share at the 16 to 25 age range. So as the population ages, this relationship should definitely continue to be explored in depth. So transitioning from age to race, this figure presents propensity to use public transit as it varies by race or ethnicity classification, with non-Hispanic whites accounting for the largest share of public transit trips in 2017 at 39.9% of all transit trips. Black non-Hispanic transit riders account for 26.5% of all transit trips in 2017, and the Hispanic population accounts for 19.3% of 2017 transit ridership. All other races account for 14.3% of transit trips, which includes persons of 2 or more races. This data indicate declines in Black and Hispanic market shares and an increase in the white market share. And to the extent that the sample weighting is correct, this confirms at least somewhat of an evolution of the transit market. This figure is showing the difference in urban and rural classification transit mode shares. And so given the overall increase in mode share embedded in the NHTS 2017 data, the increase in mode share has been dominant in the urban setting. The transit mode share for urban travelers increased from 2.4% in 2001 and 9 to 3.0% in 2017, while the rural mode share decreased from 0.5% in 2001 to 0.2% in 2009 and 2017. So this figure helps to verify that the increased transit mode share that was reported in the 2017 NHTS was focused in the urban settings. So the 2017 NHTS was the first time that TNC's transportation network companies were captured. And this figure is really interesting to me because up until 2017, so the 2001 and the 2009, is showing just taxi data. So NHTS combined these TNCs together with taxis for the 2017 mode choice. And so we really can't tease out taxi directly. However, you can see from that dramatic increase, especially in those younger age groups, that TNCs are playing a significant role when you think comparatively, though, because we are showing that top bar is a 1% share of total trips. And so we do have to think about the scale here, even though it does show a dramatic increase. So TNC use is of interest to public transportation stakeholders in that it both competes with and complements public transportation with the body of evidence, suggesting that it's contributing to soft transit ridership in several cities. According to a recent study, about a third of TNC trips would be made via public transit if TNC were not available, suggesting that TNC use is substituting some transit trips. On the other hand, TNCs appear to be penetrating neighborhoods with poor transit at least some of the time, with poor transit coverage and low car ownership, and so thus that TNCs are really have the potential to attract riders that would not otherwise have access to transit. So considering the typical demographic profiles of TNC users, and that they tend to be younger, more educated, higher earning urban dwellers, TNC use was integrated with taxi use, as I mentioned earlier, and is dominating this figure. So this figure portrays the mode share for public transit and TNC by age group. So I just wanted to give some perspective of, again, that TNC peak of that 16 to 35 age group really did only peak up to 1%. And so we're still not even close to the lowest of the transit percent shares by age group. This figure portrays the share of travel by the respective modes by age cohort. For both modes, the 26 to 45-year-old age bracket comprises the largest share of travelers, but it should be noted that these are not, the age brackets are not all the same size. The figure on this slide is presenting the trip purpose distribution for TNC and taxi trips. And the percentages are expressed as a share of all trip purposes and all trip modes. So the growth in the various categories show areas where hailed services have increased market penetration since the emergence of TNC services. Most striking, obviously, is that growth in the work-related business. And so this, excuse me, this figure is presenting that same information from the past slide, but only for 2017, and it's comparing the TNC use to the transit use. So as you can see, while TNC share did definitely increase in that work-related business, the transit share still dominates the mode share compared to TNC share. And this figure shows that the same trip purpose distribution for public transit trips for that 2009-2017 comparison. So the most pronounced changes in relative mode share between the survey years occurs for work and work-related trips, medical and dental trips, and then those other trip purposes. And that had to do with the reclassification of some of the other, other trip purposes. Transit use declined in mode share for visiting friends and relatives. So in addition to reporting TNC use in the travel diary, the NHTS survey also queried respondents regarding their use of TNCs within the past 30 days. And this figure enumerates the respondents who reported TNC use and those that reported TNC use who also reported transit use on their travel day. So of those respondents who use public transit on their travel day, 30% reported using TNCs within the last 30 days. And from this figure, you can see that transit users are about 3 times more likely to use TNC services than the general public. So that's definitely an interesting correlation. So moving into some of the competitiveness considerations, this figure is looking at the average transit travel time components. And so we're comparing 2009 with 2017 NHTS survey components. The total average transit trip time increased 13.8% between 2009 and 2017, with the greatest change in the time component related to the time spent in the vehicle, which makes sense as congestion has been increasing over those same years. Wait time was the only time component that was longer in 2009 at an average of 9.86 minutes compared to an average of 9.39 minute wait in 2017. So we dug a little bit further into these transit trip components and wanted to know how it would vary if your trip included a transfer, because the majority of transit trips do include a transfer. And so this figure displays the difference in components dependent on whether or not at least one transfer occurred on the trip. According to survey respondents, in-vehicle time for individuals whose trip involves a transfer constitutes slightly more than half of the total travel time. For trips that did not show a transfer, about 42% of travel time was in-vehicle time. These numbers suggest that the competitiveness of public transit is affected by both in-vehicle travel time, but also out-of-vehicle time. And this out-of-vehicle time is less likely to be able to be deployed productively. And you're also more likely to be exposed, if you're the traveler, to elements of the weather or other safety risks. Then as we look into the average transit trip speed trend by metro area size, as shown here, the trend from 2001 through 2017 in the varying MSA sizes. These speeds extracted from respondent-reported travel times point out the well-recognized fact that public transit travel is substantially slower than other modal travel speeds. When burdened by the need to access and egress the service, wait for the vehicle to arrive, travel via a route that may or may not be a most direct travel path, potentially have to transfer to another bus or rail, and typically stop at interim locations to allow other passengers to access and egress the vehicles. In aggregate, transit travel results in substantially slower travel times for the average personal vehicle traveler. And so we compared those two trip speeds by MSA, as you can see in this slide, and the average speeds of personal occupant vehicles are displayed in the figure to the right. And just as the average transit speed decreases as the MSA size increases, the average travel speed for POVs also decreases. However, that average POV speed, even for the densest MSA, is still faster than the average speed of transit at the least dense MSA.
Hey, Jody, right, I see there's a question here real quick. What does MSA stand for?
Oh, thank you. MSA is a metropolitan statistical area, and POV is personally operated vehicle, or a personal occupied vehicle.
Okay, thank you, Jody.
Yes, thanks. So this figure here shown on the slide is the trip speed trend by transit mode and then by rail submode. And these figures present the speed trends, and they show that the rail is getting a little faster, which is no doubt related to the expansion of services to outlying areas where running times are higher and station stops are less frequent. But speeds are also declining, as would be expected, given the increase in urban congestion levels since 2001. Bus speeds, sorry. Exclusive guideways and service purposes impact the operating speeds of all of these submodes. An MSA is larger than a TAZ. And so as we come to the conclusions for today's presentation, the data indicate that the changes in the profile of transit travelers, both with respect to travel mode and with respect to the income distribution of transit travelers. This change, while interpreted cautiously due to sample size and weighting issues, has a number of potential implications to public transportation going forward. The evidence suggests that higher income travelers are comprising a larger share of transit users, and that they are, in particular, utilizing rail services. This can be explained partially by geographic orientation of these services and their relative competitiveness with alternative means of travel. This trend has significant implications both in terms of targeting market growth opportunities, but also in terms of planning and policy implications. And these implications may merit reflection when making decisions about service pricing, funding, and service allocation or investment priorities. The NHTS dataset provides an opportunity to gain insight on transportation network company users and begins to explore interrelationships between public transportation and TNC use. Top transit cities are also top cities for TNC use. The conditions conducive to not using personal vehicles, such as very high-priced parking and being away from home on business travel, make alternatives such as TNC and public transit more viable. It's important to remember that the TNC business model is rapidly evolving, and that the NHTS data set is between 2 and 3 years old as of 2019. Thus, the TNC mode has grown dramatically and incurred numerous changes in pricing and service delivery characteristics since this data was collected. In a more general context, TNCs have the potential to be complementary to public transit in cases where they result in households relinquishing a vehicle or vehicles, such that public transit becomes a more competitive option in more travel situations. Travel speed is a critical factor in mode choice, and not surprisingly, roadway speeds have declined since prior survey years. So when you mix that bus slowing and rail getting a little faster, the comparative data on the components of overall travel time on transit shows that the largest share of increase is the in-vehicle time. And then finally, it's important to note that there's been a historic interest in national average information about transit performance and transit users. And as such, information may be relevant in informing national policies with respect to public transportation. However, there's a growing evidence that the purposes, performance, and market characteristics for public transportation are increasingly diverse across metropolitan areas. So individual agencies may find that these observations are insightful, but should also use other data sets, such as the American Community Survey and onboard or local household travel surveys, to further test the veracity of some of the observations that are derived from this analysis. And so with that, I will open the floor for comments or questions that you may have, and I'll remind you that you can type or enter your questions in the chat box on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and our moderator will ask them as they come in.
Thank you, Jody. I'm going to take it as a quick reminder before Tyler pops in. And yes, that Q&A box is located on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Just simply type in any questions and or comments that you have, and we'll hand it over to Tyler.
Okay.
Tyler, are you there?
Oh, yes, sorry.
That's okay. Go ahead with the question.
So the first question that came in, do you feel the sample size is large enough to give an actual idea of what is occurring on the road?
Yes. Yes, I think that the sample size is definitely large enough to get a general observation of what's occurring. I think, as I mentioned when I talked about some of those error cautions, is that as long as you're talking large geographies, in general, the data sample is plenty large enough.
Okay, and the second question, do you think TNC use for people who use transit on their travel days primarily due to people using TNCs for first mile, last mile on primarily transit trips, or simply people substituting TNCs for a complete transit trip? Is this able to be explored with the 2017 NHTS dataset?
Great question. So with the total mode share of less than 1% at literally every age group, I don't think that TNC use is primarily substituting transit travel. I do think in certain circumstances that TNCs may substitute transit travel, like for instance for airport trips. And I know that just from personal experience. I do think TNC related questions on the 2017 NHTS were kind of limited, but I anticipate more detailed questions to be included in future surveys to allow for more detailed analyses, is what I would expect.
Okay, the next question is the data available for the MSA in a spatial format like a shapefile for GIS?
So when we're talking NHTS data, the sample size is not it's not going to be large enough for you to get into specific MSA analyses. So you may want to use, if you're looking for MSA analyses, you may want to use the American Community Survey data, or like I mentioned, some local onboard surveys where you'll be able to get much better local data. So the NHTS data is, the sample size is great for national analyses or even kind of statewide analyses, but definitely not something to be used for MSA analysis.
Okay, next question. What factors do you think contributed to the discrepancy between the rail and bus transit mode share split for the 2009 NHTS versus NTD data?
So I think that the timing of the 2009 NHTS survey, in consideration of the economic environment in the US around that time, was really unfortunate. It seems that the trends that were initially witnessed in 2009 may be somewhat considered outliers as transit ridership trends, specifically with the increase in bus mode. It's likely correlated with the downturn of the economic conditions, and then that sampling error also has the potential to have played some sort of role in that anomaly as well.
Okay. Does the data have any information on what percent of those surveyed are disabled?
Yes, they do ask if you have any disabilities, and I believe that that's one of the person characteristics that you can look through.
And next question. You talked about how car ownership affects transit trip making and touched on income. Have you looked at the income distribution of people who are in zero vehicle households? Would this add another dimension to looking at choice riders?
So, while our analysis did consider the share of transit trips by income distribution of zero vehicle households, we didn't explicitly explore the income distribution of zero vehicle households on its own. That would allow definitely for another dimension of analysis, as one would theoretically be able to discern between households that have no vehicles by choice. It's important to remember, though, that there are many other constraints that may contribute to not owning a vehicle, including physical and mental challenges, legal or licensure challenges, just to name a few.
Okay. Do you think housing trends are a factor in some of these findings, such as the dip in middle income riders?
Yes, I definitely think housing trends play a significant role in transit trends, especially that dip in the middle income riders. Typically, you know, I think of that drive to qualify kind of saying of, you know, that middle income that's got to drive out of the CBDs in order to be able to afford the home that they're looking for, where the transit isn't necessarily as conducive and as ubiquitous.
Okay. When will the next survey data be compiled? Is this done every 8 years?
So it has not necessarily been consistent, as you can see from I think it started in 1969 and then varied, and it was approximately every 8 years. They are looking to transition to what they're calling NHTS Next Generation, I believe, and they're hoping to make this a continuous survey where they will be releasing data annually or biannually, but I'm not sure that that's been decided upon yet.
Okay. Is the data available by specific areas, meaning can we get the data only for a city like Miami or Chicago?
So again, as I mentioned earlier, the NHTS survey sample is for the entire nation is only 129,696 households. And so if you try to look for specific city data, you're going to get extremely high errors because the data there, the sample size doesn't allow for data to be explored at such a small level. Right, and so as I mentioned earlier, sources like the American Community Survey, which has a bit larger survey sample size, may help, or other local surveys that may have been done by the local transit agencies would likely be more meaningful in any data analysis that you're looking to focus on a specific city.
Thank you. And I think we don't have any more questions right now, so I'll hand it back to Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Tyler and Jody, for the great presentation today. I'm going to open up the evaluation on your end. If for whatever reason that evaluation does not appear, it is located in the link section. Just look for the link that's titled Evaluation 8.29.19 and just click on that and then hit Browse to, and the evaluation will pop up on your end. This evaluation is not only important to the entire Qatar Transportation webcast series, but is also very valuable feedback to Jody and the other presenters who take the time out of their schedule to provide you with some great content. We do have our next Qatar Transportation webcast. It is scheduled for a Tuesday, September 10th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. A special presenter, David Hensher, he's from Australia, so that is a 7 o'clock start time for those on the East Coast. He will be talking about shared mobility, mass and public transport, a new future. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you in 2 weeks. If you're in the path of the hurricane, please stay safe. Thank you, everybody.